substance equals spin. The propaganda's a win, stress feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 1 of 200, the independent media and politics podcast, where I say the same thing every week. We have another ensemble cast. Very good. Joined by all people who are co-hosts. No special guests today. Ginny, you're currently unmuted. Welcome.
Welcome to me. Why did I say it like that? Like a clown. Like a clown doing an entry at the circus. Welcome to me. Hi. Yeah, I'm here today. I'm going to talk about things related to life happening in places and not just stuff related to my ethnicity, which everyone can guess at the end of the episode.
We're going to do a raffle for it, you know?
Yeah.
And that was the charming voice of Simon, who's also joining us today.
Yeah. Kyle, I love that you introduced it like a Howard Stern radio host, like, welcome to 1 of 200.
Well, we're going to try and intensify that every week from now on.
By the end, it's going to be last time on 1 of 200 Z.
Oh, man, that's my dream. Mark Rickaby back for the first time in a little while. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. It has been a while, hasn't it? I was thinking maybe I wouldn't be coming so much because I'm usually pretty busy in the weekends, but I've had lots of ideas for sort of one-off episodes, but it's been hard to put everything together, so it's kind of easy for me to just come in and have a little rant.
Fantastic.
And then sort of disappear again.
And then we'll get you back at some point for a long-form episode about the Alpine Fault, just to tease our listeners with that sometime in the future. And our final co-host for today, Josephine, how are you doing?
Kia ora. I'm good. Yeah, it's fun to hear your professional, start of the podcast. So yeah, looking forward to having a chat and a rant with all of you today.
Fantastic. And it might be a chat and a rant, but we're all really knowledgeable and expert in everything we talk about. So I just want to make sure the audience understands that. Another week where too much has happened. It's even bigger stuff than last week and the week before that. Atrocities have intensified. Just wild political activities have intensified. And New Zealand hasn't been left out of the firing line this time either. The first thing on the agenda is the Nuseirat Massacre, which was perpetrated by Israel at the beginning of the week, over the weekend, after we'd recorded last week's episode. Just horrible atrocity being celebrated by Western media, by Western politicians. People talk about the Western media and Western political leadership gaslighting people, but we're so far beyond that at this point. This was one of the clearest number ratio indications of how little the West values Palestinian lives. It has been framed in the West as a rescue mission to rescue 4 Israeli prisoners. And at this point as well, there's even a juxtaposition between the use of the word hostages or prisoners of war, because some of these hostages are IDF. They are enemy combatants. And to do this, instead of agreeing to the ceasefire, which Hamas and the US apparently have both agreed to, Israel has decided they don't want any of their hostages back, despite how often that is used as a club by the Western media to beat Palestinians with, and to beat Palestinian solidarity movements with. What they'd like to do instead is kill almost 300 Palestinian civilians to extricate the Israeli prisoners, and do it under the auspice of aid workers. They all hid in a aid truck, jumped out and just started killing people. This is one of the clearest breaches of humanitarian and international law of the war so far as the number of things they are doing on the record and admitting to.
It's one of the first and fundamental war crimes, right? That as international law sort of really crystallized in the 19th century, even when there was still an argument for making and waging a just, aggressive war, and people were making those arguments before Nuremberg, before all of that, disguising yourself as a medic or an aid worker and then using that to cause an attack is one of the very first things you can't do, right? Like, it's just, and for such obvious reasons, because it sows so much distrust, because it causes so much chaos, because it's just vile, right? And I'll let somebody who's a lot more primed to talk about this, but I just wanted to say that, like, for me, coming from a sort of media perspective, I think Israel doing the plot from Taken is really indicative of the fact that a lot of fantasy action media really primes people for the sort of excuses and arguments which get made about real events which happen here, the dehumanization of an enemy. And I know that it's kind of, it seems almost trite to talk about something like television or about film when this is a real thing that happened. But if you want to understand news framing lenses, you have to understand that collapse between fantasy and between news reporting and what is supposed to be something that deals with real issues and real things that happen in real people's lives just extinguished.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll just note as well on that, on the aid worker stuff. So this is a crime of perfidy. And anyone who's been following this will remember that this has constantly been aimed at Hamas, while the Israeli occupation forces have been targeting ambulances, been targeting food aid vehicles. Their claim has incorrectly, they've been lying about this, has been that, oh, there are Hamas fighters in that ambulance, in that hospital. They've been making this claim about Hamas the entire time, while using it to kill civilians and UN aid workers and journalists. And it's not even the first time that Israel has done this. Earlier in the genocide, they dressed up as doctors and entered a hospital and executed a man who was paralyzed in his hospital bed.
Yeah.
It's really sick.
Yep. And I think it's really important to also remember that this prisoner exchange or hostage exchange could have happened peacefully in October, in November. There are multiple deals that have been rejected by Israel for peaceful exchange of all the hostages. So, none of this was necessary if one of those peace negotiations was accepted by Israel. So this is really not about getting those hostages out. It is about continuing the genocide. And for me, the most striking thing about the Nuseirat massacre, I mean, it's another event in a chain of events, including, for example, the Flower Massacre, where people were going to get humanitarian aid and massacred while they were doing that, shot at while they're doing that, snipers being used sometimes
Against children.
Against children, against mothers, against women. It's just a chain of tragedies. But the most striking thing about this one is how they use that aid pier, which was built a few months ago. And I remember some commentators, anti-imperialist commentators, calling this a naked act of imperialism. And a lot of people were like, hey, what do you expect United States to do? We're trying to help out here. Now, if we do this, then we're getting criticized as imperialists. And this Nuseirat massacre is exactly what we knew that United States was going to do. Of course, the United States is going to support Israel's agenda, which is genocide. And so, yeah, we have a right to be extremely critical and suspicious of the intentions of the United States. And this massacre, in my view, is a symbol of what Western aid has meant to the global South over the period of imperialism and over the period of neocolonialism. So this is not only in Palestine. This is the case of Western aid work. in other parts of the world. We can see that, there, on the one hand, there will be a little bit of humanitarian aid. On the other hand, there's drone strikes. This has been happening in Pakistan. This has been happening in many other regions where the United States is, bombing, droning, and all those sorts of things. So they have this narrative of moral superiority, and the aid aspect of it is a massive part of that huge narrative of, hey, these people are in trouble because of their own, corruption, their own primitiveness, their own problems. We are only trying to support them. We are the civilized, trying to, civilize the uncivilized through aid and all that. But, again, it's that contrast of, on the one hand, supporting, giving arms, or directly getting involved in destruction of civilian infrastructure, civilian lives, and then on the other hand, a little bit of aid.
You touch on a number of points there, but one that I wanted to draw out is exactly that this is, being sort of frivolous for a moment. It's the plot of Taken if the people who took his daughter had offered to give her back at the very start, because in fact Liam Neeson was holding like 300 people in his basement, right? That the reason why Hamas had offered that from the very beginning is because, firstly, October the 7th was essentially a jailbreak out of a concentration camp. But secondly, and primarily because Israel continues to and has always just imprisoned in its carceral system Palestinian people for almost no reason as a means of terrorizing the population, for disciplining its labor force, because Palestinians are also an underclass, an exploited class within Israel itself, because it is an apartheid society within Israel. Outside, of course, it's genocidal, which is much worse. But the sheer amount of people who, including children, who have been held in Israel is something which is why that was always on the table. And this is continually both illustrative of the United States' actions, where it pretends like Palestinian actors, whether that's the PA, the Palestinian Authority, or whether that is Hamas or before them Fatah, is not coming to the table. It's just this diplomatic pretense which they use to kind of pretend that there's a neutrality to it while supporting one side. Like if you look at the 1990s, the Camp David Accords, the standard narrative about the Camp David Accords is that Palestine couldn't accept the deal that was on the table. In fact, there were huge concessions beyond what the United Nations had put down in its 1967 borders, in resolution since then, which Palestine accepted. Like it was going to accept what was really not a feasible two-state solution. It was then, as discussions continued at Taba, where Israel had undermined continuously the deal and just blew it up. But those things were behind closed doors. That wasn't Bill Clinton smiling for the cameras. And that's the reason why that's not remembered in the historical memory. But if you look at the actual historical narrative, if you look at the documentary record, Israel has consistently and always undermined that. And this goes all the way back, not only to the initial colonization of Palestine and in the Nakba in 1948, when it began its ethnic cleansing, but when Israel had relatively settled borders and the compromise solution, the two-state solution, was effectively settled in the 1960s. And then Israel starts to wage wars, and in 1967, and it expands its borders. It steals the Golan Heights. It continues to expand outwards. So we see that this has always happened. This has always been the MO of Israel. So when people say, well, facts aren't always known immediately in the minutes that succeed in an attack, right? But I think we have the right, after this many decades and understanding Israel's behavior and the way that its political structure operates, not to trust every fucking thing that comes out of an official's mouth in Israel or from the US State Department, because all they do is lie about this. This is all the historical record is. And I think we really need to understand that this long predates October the 7th, but that's the reason why we understand that Hamas had made those overtures early on, because it is an actual diplomatic force which is willing to make concessions because they're realists, and Israel is not. They're rabid.
Absolutely. And, that goes for a lot of the rest of the Western world as well. Despite many leaders being forced by their electorate to make concessions, at least in the wording of what they're saying, they stay aligned with the genocide in terms of not sanctioning Israel, continuing arms sales. There are some carve-outs from that, but nothing of real, nothing has been able to stop it. And that's really what it all comes down to. Let's move on from that to the EU elections briefly, which occurred this week. They seem to have gone pretty badly for Europe by and large, with a significant shift towards the far right. I think several countries have now announced elections, snap elections off the back of it, because the ruling party took such a strong hit in the EU elections, and they see themselves threatened in national electoral context as well. Funniest of all was France, which Macron immediately calling a snap election when he saw that Le Pen had taken a much larger proportion of seats at the EU than previously. Wait, this is really, really not great. Is this an indication, do we think? And this is a chance for prognostication. Obviously, we can't. I say this, but sometimes we predict these things and they come true. So keep that in mind. Is this an early warning sign that Europe itself on the national level, as well as at the European elections, which have a much lower turnout, which are not as impactful maybe as some of the national elections, is going far right, are trending heavily towards fascism? Or is it just part of the same old, like, okay, we all saw this coming, but like this, of course this happened?
Well, I'm looking at Europe from a third world perspective, and none of this matters. Whoever comes, the fascists, the centrists, the European Union is a fascist organization in terms of their foreign policy towards Asia, Africa, Latin America. Look at what the hell they've been doing in terms of Palestine. European head Ursula von der Leyen has multiple times supported Israel and officially, expressed her support for the genocide of Palestinians. And this is the history of Europe. Look at, France under Macron. How can we describe French foreign policy towards its former colonies in the northern part of Africa? Niger, for example, is the third poorest country in the world, and French neocolonialism is so intense over there. They are extracting all their uranium, whatever potential they have. This is a country largely not having electricity, whereas they are electrifying and powering up France. So third poorest country in the world. These policies are what reflect Europe's, what Europe is to the rest of the world. So I don't really think that when you think about it historically, there has been a change, regardless of which side comes into power. Maybe there are some changes domestically, some implications, but looking from the third world, it doesn't change. It's all the same. They always support neocolonialism. They also support cheap extraction of resources and labor, keeping us from developing and so forth. So yeah, it doesn't change anything for Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific, of the Kanaki movement, for example.
Well, I was going to say on that note, one immediate change, which actually has kind of been good, is that France, after announcing the elections, has chosen to back down on its electoral reforms in Kanaki, which is good news. So I guess I mean, it's not end of the woods.
No, it's quelling the current, situation, but at the same time, it's not still showing any indication of, acknowledging or moving towards self-determination of Kanak people. So, I mean, yeah, they're dabbling with these reforms here and there, yeah.
I'm just thinking if some of these countries do have an ascendant far right, maybe they just get too busy fighting themselves at home.
Yeah, and that's the other side of it, right? So the far right in the West has recently become critical of some of this foreign policy. So I don't really know what it could be, that there is less investment in fueling the war in Ukraine, for example, which I'm noticing a lot of far right in the West have been critical of the kind of funding that's going into some of these wars. So yeah, it would be interesting to see how it changes foreign policy.
Look, I think some of these are in bad faith. You look at a figure like Bannon, who sort of cynically uses the anti-war sentiment in the United States to promote a pretend kind of isolationism, and the reason for doing that is because the left is so shut out of any of these traditional institutions, the agenda-setting media, that the only people who can really get a set of column inches in the New York Times is people who are right wingers, and therefore that's the only way in which we see that come through. But I think they use it in bad faith pretty clearly, and fascists have always done that. But another thing is that even though I think, it might be a marginal thing, and you're totally right that this has always been the case, no matter who gets in power, right? In New Zealand, for example, the people that the forefather that Labour loves, Mickey Savage, like New Zealand controlled Samoa at the time, and as part of its sort of imperial constellation, right, in the Pacific, and as us being a kind of, well, like essentially an Israel in the Pacific for Britain, right?
Yeah.
You might think of it that way, that this is all true. However, I do think that as we've seen these migrant flows back into Europe because of the sheer destruction, because of climate destruction in the third world, that fascist solutions, which are really just kind of liberal solutions kind of cranked up, do make somewhat of a difference, even if it's a marginal difference for people. That's not necessarily true in the United States anymore. Like Obama was the deporter in chief, and then, we're all familiar with Trump's border policy, and none of those things have been rolled back under Biden. In fact, ICE, everybody has stopped talking about ICE, but it still exists.
Well, it's got worse just recently.
Right.
It has.
But in Europe, I think if you look at England, you can see that, the Windrush generation and that kind of scandal, or Rwanda, all of those were under its Tory government. And it is really concerning that even though Starmer appears to be getting a supermajority, that really it's because the Tory vote is split between the Tories and quote unquote Reform Party, which is this more extreme Nigel Farage-like right-wing party. So there are a bit of concerns there. And I'm not saying that necessarily means that there is anything significantly better about Starmer, but I think that it does make somewhat of a marginal kind of difference for the purely on the inflow into Europe basis. But as you point out, the same sort of tactics are really, we talk about discourse and colonialism a lot on this podcast, and I think the techniques of fascism are just the colony and the periphery brought in toward the metropole, right? That is totally true. And I don't think you're wrong to say that. I just think that at least for a small period of time, where there is this kind of backflow back into Europe, that it does make a slight difference depending on if there is an Orban in power versus not. But it's not like the centrists are going to stop them.
I was just going to say the other thing where I think there could be a difference. It is that sort of domestic politics feedback loop, but I think it's the repression of left movements that has the potential for more fascist governments in Europe to just start to crack down on people, just that could cause a huge amount of damage. So I think, like, we don't really know where that's going to go, but we know that people have announced their intentions, and there is always this kind of undercurrent of violence. I mean, sometimes I think maybe there's a sort of polite bourgeois society is intrinsically linked to violence in that kind of a way. And that's just like maybe unavoidable. But I think that when you see these movements coming to political prominence in Europe, that sort of thing beneath the surface is actually becoming a bit more visible.
I think that, that's a debatable thing, whether the centrists or the right are worse to destroy left movements. Which one is more effective in Europe? I don't know. Like, if you think about Corbyn's movement, it was equally destroyed from within the Labour Party, the centrists within the Labour Party, for example. And, if you think about it historically in New Zealand or, in so many other contexts, the centrists are probably more effective in destroying our left movements.
Well, the centrists are
in
also the
many
on-ramp,
ways.
right? The centrists are the on-ramp to the far right. And that's now being shown in almost every European country we're talking about now. We're seeing it in places like Argentina. We're seeing it in the US. We're seeing it in Canada, where because the left is, as Simon said, so shut out of kind of established platforms, and in terms of what they're allowed to talk about or where they're considered as being a part of the conversation or discussion, the centre never needs to look that way. when it comes to electoral politics. And so they keep shuffling right. And then sometimes they break into a gallop.
Yeah, I'm remembering the 2020 elections when Ardern really didn't have a big, election manifesto, but one of her key points was to say that we are not going to institute a wealth tax. This was her massive, election point. So again, how the center keeps destroying and dismantling the left more effectively sometimes.
And because the left is a threat to the center, they just don't need to fight them in the same way they have to fight the right. It's frustrating to watch, and we're right in the middle of that kind of process here in New Zealand. So the big, I guess, New Zealand politics events of the week have all been around infrastructure, which, as far as we've seen, are around the funneling of public resources to private interests. Absolutely no surprise that this is going to happen. It's been happening for the entirety of the term so far. But Chris Bishop stood up this week and basically made it even clearer than it already had been, saying there's an infrastructure debt, but we're not allowed to borrow. We can't possibly tax people more. There's no other thing we can do. There's only one way forward, and that's to get private interests to help us build stuff. Triple P agreements, so public-private partnerships, have just routinely failed in New Zealand. But what they are really good at doing is giving a lot of money to politicians' mates. They've been a really good vehicle for corruption. I think Transmission Gully is probably the one that's most in the public consciousness. Is it finished yet? I don't know. But
I've driven on it.
But the cost blew out.
It's already, going to be falling apart. So
yeah, and now we're heading into essentially an infrastructure regime where those are what is being used to build our major roading infrastructure. And the way apparently we're going to be paying for that as the public, other than just using tax revenue, is with toll roads. So with road charges. And I don't know, it just feels really short-sighted.
Before you launch totally into that, housing is kind of infrastructure too. And I just wanted to add a little addendum to the news, is that we totally called that Bill English would be making bank out of his Kāinga Order report, right? Do you want to say something about that, Kyle, just very quickly as like a follow-up to previous weeks?
Yeah, so Bill English did a report saying Kāinga Order was bad and not spending its money very well. He was paid $500,000 for that. And it came out this week that he suggested the people who could fix that, his daughter's company, on which he's on the board of.
Yeah, amazing. Why do you hate progress, Kyle?
But that's completely indicative. It's completely indicative of how this works. And we have Mark here to really get into some of the details of the destituteness of our infrastructure and construction policies here in New Zealand.
Well, I think you covered it pretty well in that summary. I think, so one thing that occurs to me and it's true of that Bill English report as well, that there's not really a lot of analysis that goes on. You can always kind of tell the direction. And actually, they have been telegraphing this quite a lot, pretty much since last year, but particularly in March and April, the rhetoric sort of ramped up. Because they're like in New Zealand, there's always this thing of, and this goes right back to the 80s. You can see in a lot of the sort of neoliberal stuff then, business wants certainty, business likes certainty. And so they've been going on and on pretty much since elected about giving this certainty, which is that, and it does have to be packaged differently for different audiences, but it's really all about kind of setting that agenda and that expectation, and just kind of slowly, belligerently, obnoxiously just getting the public used to this shit that's going to happen that people generally don't like, right? Because people in New Zealand generally don't like neoliberalism. They generally don't like public-private partnerships that don't really deliver on their promises. But there is a certain class of people who do like it. And this is sort of what is being presented here. Bishop was speaking to local government New Zealand. So on Thursday, he basically kind of took some of these telegraphed hints from the last few months, and he made it quite explicit. He said they want more private sector financing. Public-private partnerships are just one example of that. There could be others. Toll roads, sort of forms of value capture where I guess the sort of land is like kind of sliced up and there's kind of some weird balance sheet fuckery around the government kind of renting stuff back that was previously maybe Crown land or Māori land being kind of, there's a long history of it with sort of public works and how these roads actually ended up in this kind of situation. So, and the national complaint are claiming that this is all stuff that they campaigned on. I guess like the sort of the dumbassery to me is like this idea that we can't buy our way out of infrastructure deficit, but it's like,
what a weird thing to say.
Like you can't do stuff. Material reality kind of requires work and energy, and that requires some sort of exchange. Like you literally have to buy the road. You can't and the other thing is, I guess, kind of going back to what you said at the start, like infrastructure isn't permanent, and we kind of treat these things like this sort of, we do these massive projects and we just think, okay, that's it, it's done. And then like one of the most ridiculous things that Bishop said last week was this kind of like, we have to invest in maintenance. And it's like, that's the whole fucking point. Like successive governments have not been doing that. It's like, this isn't a revelation. This is a systemic, like actual agenda that has been happening. And so there's like, it's quite bleak. The sort of like infrastructure has to be paid for. Like, I mean, come on, like the public is not that stupid. Like, what are we supposed to sort of believe? But I guess, what it is a kind of move towards user pays. I think what we're lacking is actually seeing analysis and breakdowns of whether this user pays stuff in these public-private partnerships actually can cover the shortfall. We actually don't we're not really being shared like numbers and actual analysis of like what, and like, National have gone in and said they want to build these 15 new roads. They're bringing back roads of national significance. They say it's going to fix congestion, which we know like empirically is a load of shit because of induced demand. Building more roads leads to more vehicles on the road. There's no acknowledgement of that. Just tacking on more lanes. And they're not talking about, they're talking about unlocking potential, but they're not actually talking about how they are going to do that. It's all in the sort of fuckery around finance schemes and value capture and this magical idea that the private sector involvement is going to lead to more efficient delivery and value capture and generating additional revenue, like while they reduce budgets for, they've reduced Waka Kotahi's budget, they've reduced pretty much everything, they've just cut. So there's what they're saying in the actuality is kind of, it's completely misaligned.
They've cut major public transport initiatives. So the big ones are Northern Rail now, and also the connecting ferry between North and South Island. Huge projects and a huge loss of investment that would already put into those. And to do that while saying, oh, we have to also pay for maintenance, and then announcing more roads, which are the piece of infrastructure that needs more maintenance in New Zealand than any other piece of infrastructure. While not looking at heavy freight as a risk to those roads, while not looking at climate change as a risk to those roads. If you're saying we need to look at maintenance while making a $4 billion promise for pothole fixing and then announcing more roads, like these things don't line up. You can't, like, there's an inherent contradiction there.
It's just like, how far behind is the government in terms of its infrastructure vision? Doesn't it like locate itself within the context that we are living in, which is a context of, climate catastrophe happening, a context of huge, research and innovation in terms of what kind of infrastructure will work for the future generations. None of this is coming into the picture. It's the old, neoliberal, we just need to, involve private money in it. we want, like you said, Mark, yeah, we want to see your analysis. We want to see how we are placed within the current research on and developments on infrastructure. This is one of the most important things that will take us into the future. And yeah, the lack of analysis, the lack of vision, the lack of acknowledgement of, you know, some of the strides that many other countries are making in terms of infrastructure. None of this is coming into picture. It's sad.
I was gonna say, I'm not sure if people actually know this potentially about the government decision making / infrastructure / anything process, but pretty much all of the engagement that that outside firms do, like market research or advertising or branding or whatever, when I hear about these frankly quite ludicrous decisions to spend a lot of money on road maintenance or something, or to cancel really, really popular train services, as someone who works within the market research and advertising industry, we have had contracts out for things assessing stuff like the downstream impact of infrastructure changes or infrastructure cuts since like April this year and May this year. Like, I want to sort of make people aware that a lot of the stuff that we see now that's come down the train, the government decided on doing this months ago. And all they did when they farmed out this work to market research firms was to try and get like a third party to say that, oh, we've researched this and that's how we're going to do it. And so any data the government will give you about this project is tainted, because all these firms that get these contracts out, they are told what the government's message and alignment is supposed to be. And that's where all the results will come from. And just in terms of like thinking about these solutions that seem so strange to us because they don't at all capture New Zealand's technical capability when it comes to things like reducing the effects of climate change, it doesn't capture even at all on like a local government level what people are most passionate about or sort of what serves the community. If you think of these solutions as individual answers in a survey, when you ask the quote unquote average New Zealander what they think would make their life better right now that the government could fix, I feel like that kind of makes it make a little bit more sense. Like if you asked an average person who drove to Auckland all the time, which is most of a survey pool for this country's representative surveys, they would say, oh, the roads are shit. Maybe we should fix those. You know what I mean? They wouldn't say, oh, I really care about the Northern Rail because this person has a car. A lot of these decisions are being made based on research done by firms that are essentially survey farms. And a lot of these firms, when they talk about, oh, we found you the average New Zealander, they're talking about someone within like maybe a 20-mile radius of Auckland who probably has a car, who probably is someone who is Pākehā, who has a well-paid job because of their proximity to metropolitan life. So in terms of whether or not these changes make any sense, I mean, it's true they don't. But I do want to sort of make it clear that this is not something that the government is sitting in its, I guess, the back rooms of Wellington thinking about at all. They're farming out all this thought to market research firms who are telling them exactly what they've already said they want to hear. And this stuff was decided like maybe like 4 or 5 months ago already as a country.
Well, it was locked in by previous governments as well. Like regardless of the sort of the investments that the previous Labour government had made into alternative forms of transport than just like roads. And they did promise a bunch of roading investments as well, but they did shut down the sort of roads of national significance, and but they were not able to change the structural sort of aspects of the New Zealand economy that kind of lead to this situation. And I think it's really interesting that you say that about the sort of the whole feedback loop of things just kind of it's like the status quo maintaining itself. And National is just so much about the status quo. I found this election poster from Muldoon in 1975 that I just think just captures it so in such a pure way. It's just like National's vision for New Zealand's future, and it's like New Zealand the way you want it. And it's just like there is no vision, there is no future. It's like Muldoon literally said this, like he wanted to leave New Zealand no worse but no better than how he found it. Like just this, it's just this perpetuation of and this is the thing, and both of you touched on this before, like climate change is happening. We're getting these massive atmospheric river events. We have this this geotechnical approach to roads, which requires them to be completely impermeable water has to sort of sit on the surface and be kind of distributed off to the side. That requires huge amounts of like land engineering and all sorts of channeling the water away. But it doesn't kind of work because we're getting the level of like rain events, these heavy trucks, and just like generally cars have been getting heavier and heavier year on year. The trend is going upwards. So all the calculations and the stats that are being used for road resilience are out of date. Because like these roads are cracking and problems are occurring earlier and earlier. So the lifetime of like road maintenance is decreasing. The amount of damage to roads is going up and up. And then we have these exacerbating factors of these rain events. So we're kind of like, it's just only getting more and more expensive. I mean, one kind of terrifying thought is that, well, I mean, maybe it's not terrifying. It's just a kind of the status quo doing its thing, is like that this roading obsession is going to bankrupt the country. Like we are literally going to see the country like have a massive financial crisis due to just building nothing but roads and having a construction industry and a sort of like a whole kind of infrastructure supply chain that is just literally like two materials, chipped up grey wacky rock and bitumen asphalt oil product. And that's it. And all we can do is just slap them down on like eroded and broken potholed roads.
And we're not even good at it. I want to say we're not even good at this. We're bad at making roads.
Yeah,
Meanwhile, look at China and its public infrastructure projects and how they're moving forward. It has the largest rail network, high-speed rail network in the world, and it's far ahead of, all the other countries that come after it. So, Mark, do you have any idea about what's going on in China? Maybe we should look there. For some ideas.
Josephine, every day I look at a map of New Zealand's maximum rail infrastructure in this country from the 1950s and I cry myself to sleep. Like Mark says, sorry, I'll let Mark talk because you've directly hailed, but like Mark says before, we live in the long 1980s, right? Like this became standard then, and I think this is somewhat of a forgotten history, but I recently watched thanks to somebody, a frontline program from TVNZ from 1990, which is banned in New Zealand. And the reporting there kind of pointed out and just went through very closely that there were like maybe 10 to 15 individual executive donors to the Labour Party in the 1987 campaign when Roger Douglas was finance minister, right? And those people all directly received money from the government for these public-private partnerships, or they got share bumps, or like assets that were held by the Crown were sold off to them for pennies on the dollar, right? It was direct, immediate corruption. And when this was reported on, and one of the only reports that happened, TVNZ had pressure exerted on it by those people, by the Business Roundtable, which essentially was, one of the cabals that dismantled the state infrastructure of this country in the 80s and handed it off to, local and American executive interests. And TVNZ responded to the pressure placed on it by firing the reporter, firing the director, and the producer moved on. And then we were never allowed to see that program ever again. And many members of that government brought defamation lawsuits against the press for having dared to report on their corruption. And now, and kids might not understand this, and I am also one of these young people, if you don't know that history, that didn't used to be normal. It didn't used to be normal that Bill English would be given a knighthood, go and make a report on how social housing used to be sold to private interests, and then he directly benefits from that being sold to private interests and be the person that it's kind of handed over to, right? Like, and this is true of our roads. This is true of of almost all of our public infrastructure. We have this weird corporatization of our water infrastructure, which makes absolutely zero sense. And that's not only, things that get sold off to private interests for pennies on the dollar, like, for example, Springs in Upper Hutt just kind of going to the Coca-Cola company for absolutely nothing, and we're not making any money off it for no reason. It's just going to private interests overseas, but also to local companies which have these corporate structures to them, to SEOs, to state-owned enterprise, SOEs, state-owned enterprises. Everything becomes this kind of neoliberalization. We live in the long 1980s. It never ended. This is just the way that it's been since then for 40 fucking years. And it needs to end.
Could not agree more. At risk of going off on a massive tangent on all that stuff, which I won't. I think I'll go back to the point about China, because that might be a good seg into the sort of
Yay,
part.
China.
Everyone in the world wants China's infrastructure, right? They are doing things with rail and with connectivity, and like large scale construction that everyone in the world wants. I think the problem here is that this long 1980s has just prevented us from being able to mobilize and operationalize like effective investment. So like we don't even have investment. There's sort of no reason to invest here. And it's not, there's not really any profit in a lot of these things. So there needs to be some kind of like big picture kind of change. So I think even with China sort of level, I just don't see this country able to deploy or operationalize stuff to that extent. But I think we need to think about these things, because we have to think not so much about, oh, we can't afford it, or China has a large economy, so they can do stuff we can never do, or the sort of, the poison chalice, if we build China's infrastructure, then China's going to infiltrate our society, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's a good segue.
That's
a
more
good
fundamental
segue.
than that.
That's
We just need to
actually
decide
really good.
what we want the country to be, right? We need
Mark,
to
why do you
decide
hate
what
the
we want.
West?
Yeah.
I don't hate the West. I grew up in swimming in neoliberalism. I hate neoliberalism. No, I just, like, my last point, I just think fundamentally you can't get a future unless you have an idea for what that's going to be. You can't focus on balance sheets until there's like a purpose for those balance sheets. You can't bring in contractors or designers from all over the world or from wherever to do anything unless you know what you want. The problem for New Zealand is we are, like Simon kind of alluded to, we have these old boys networks who are basically making the decisions for us. And we need as a society to recognize that if we don't have a vision for that future, we are just going to be in the status quo for longer. I think I will leave it there, though.
And that brings us to our final topic for the weekend.
Yeah, Ginny, you're a person of ethnic extraction.
This is when
I
people
wasn't
get to
gonna
play
leave it
the
quite that
guessing.
hard.
People get to play the guessing game. They're like, which East Asian country are my parents from? And
I'm
then
waiting for somebody to say Malaysia, and you reach through the screen and strangle them.
Yeah, I just become, who's that genocidal guy from Dragon Ball Z again?
Which one?
I just become Frieza, like when someone tells me that.
Okay, Frieza was a property developer, and business needs certainty.
Same thing.
Sorry,
Business needs certainty, Ginny.
Understood. I agree.
To properly intro, New Zealand has its latest round in media poll circles of security interests feeding lines and data and surveillance information to a journalist who then writes a Red Scare documentary. And genuinely, I am happy to treat this documentary and the four or five sensationalist follow-up articles, the announcements by people across the political spectrum, and the completely intentional misreading of what's happening here by a cohort of people in the information space as entirely pathetic. We see this happen every 2 or 3 years. Australia and the US make a hawkwards turn towards China. And suddenly the NZSIS and the GCSB putting up spokespeople for a brave and steadfast journalist to interview on camera, and often saying things that are either completely contradictory to other things in the public realm or to things they're also saying in the same documentary. It's absurd. It's xenophobic, and it it aligns us like with interests that we should just want no part of as a small trading nation at the periphery. Like even from a realist point of view, aligning ourselves with China hawks is fucking stupid. But we've got 4 people on this podcast who are better prepped to talk about this than I am. I want to hand it over to you to start with, Josephine, because you have quite a lot to say about the way that this has been framed. I just want to get ahead of everyone who is going to be screaming that we are tankies for daring to take even a neutral stance on China, or to suggest that there should be some level of journalistic integrity when we are talking about these things. Apparently that makes us puppets for Xi Jinping. Fuck you. Like, it's so fucking tired. Go get some new lines. It's embarrassing. You're embarrassing yourselves, and you can fuck off. Josephine.
I think that, the journalists involved in that, in the making of that documentary can be very proud of themselves for being part of this project to manufacture consent, for priming us to be part of AUKUS. This is what I think the main function of that documentary is. It is priming us to, to being part of this unnecessary militarization of our part of the world. It's AUKUS is we are moving away from our nuclear free commitment through this AUKUS, involvement. They're using all these sorts of language where they're saying that we're not being part of the military element of AUKUS. It's a technology part of AUKUS that we're becoming part of. But, let's be real about this. The whole AUKUS thing is just an escalation and militarization to serve the interests of United States' new Cold War against China. And, I remember reading, some of the conversations that were happening in our chat on One of 200. And somebody said, I think the best way to approach China is to just see China normally. Let's not use this, lens of yellow peril. And people needn't lionize or heroize China either. Let's just look at it as a normal country. And, with a huge history of connection with New Zealand. Chinese people have been part of New Zealand society since the 19th century, a big part of New Zealand society, but they're still treated as this, the strange enemy or aliens whom we all need to be suspicious of. And, when I watched the documentary and it came, it was painful watching it. It was like, sorry for my language, about a couple of Karens, xenophobic Karens talking about China.
Karen is a slur, so I'm glad you apologized.
And they try to preempt their xenophobia by saying that we spoke with Chinese people. But surprise, surprise, Chinese people are not a monolith. You can find people who are against the Chinese state to speak in your documentary and base your documentary on that. And it will, reinforce your xenophobia. And so, yeah, it was painful to watch. And the message that I got from it is that the only Chinese people that we can trust are the ones who are against the Chinese state, and anyone who supports the Chinese state are potential spies. That's the message that I got from that. It's like, it's that yellow peril narrative that New Zealand settler colonial state, kind of started propounding since the beginning of colonization. It's a continuation. So this documentary can be proud that it's the latest in the series of yellow peril narrative, which otherizes and creates suspicion against China. And, one of the arguments they were saying is that Fiona Lee, who's a member of the Chinese community, attending a conference in China, which Xi Jinping also attended. And so therefore she is suspicious. do the same standards apply to somebody attending, a European conference where some European leaders will attend? Will they be considered, suspicious for spying or interfering in New Zealand's democracy? So it's really interesting to see the double standards in which, China is treated compared to other Western nations, which in my view, the biggest threat to New Zealand's democracy from a foreign power is from the United States. And, we are openly part of a spying network, which openly spies on our activities. And United States government is very much involved in trying to shape New Zealand's policy in favor of them. And this has been the story for a long time. We don't see, journalists questioning this. I really wish that they did question United States in their future work. I'm looking forward to seeing that, but I don't think, that's going to come. Yeah, that's my take. Thank you.
I think one of the really frustrating things about that is how when you bring up Western spying, and we've had a couple of things this year to do with the GCSB and foreign interests. Simon's given me a look. I'll leave some of the details of that for him to get into. But it's just hand waved away as, oh, they have the same values as us, though, which is shorthand for Western values, which is racism. Shorthand for, it's just outright racism. It's like, oh, that's not Eastern values. And it's very, very obvious. And if you track it back and then see who the proponents of this shit are, you just get to the far right and outright fascists very, very quickly. And I'm not using that term as a catch-all here, or an implication where you go, okay, yeah, that guy, he's not saying he's a fascist, but he does have some fascist takes. These are people who are like, hey, I'm a Nazi, and I think we should bring back Christian Western values. That should be a huge warning sign whenever someone is using that language about who we ally ourselves with in the international sphere. Because, man, even just on a very low level reading, the US are our allies and we want to stand by them. Yeah, but will you say that when Trump is in charge? We want to work with the EU. Okay, they've just flipped towards the far right with some out neo-Nazi parties like the AfD in Germany taking a huge number more seats than they had previously. Do you really? Is that whose values you share? Let's have another think about that. Let's interrogate it and let's think about what's actually best for Aotearoa.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally it's that racism thing, which no one likes no one likes breaking this issue down to racism. And that's far from the only component. But if you look at the language used, even just in articles just before this documentary got released, and also just after, and also in the past couple of years, people will say some incredibly strange things. And it goes right down to what Josephine was saying about how people just can't view China as a normal country. I think it was a Herald Rand article that said stuff like, if we were not diligent trade partners with China, that we would anger the dragon. What does that mean? What does anger the dragon mean? It's actually ridiculous. Who thinks like that? And also just the language used around the most current documentary. I think people were saying things like how China was striking at the beating heart of our democracy. What beating heart of democracy? Someone gets off a bus stop, 3 stops in the consulate, and that's striking at our beating heart of democracy. Actually get a grip. And it's just this language which is consistent and has been happening for, as Josephine said, years and years and years. Through mainstream articles, even in fluff pieces propped up by governments at the time. I just think that it's almost impossible for people to have sane dialogue around China because they just don't view Chinese people within the country, let alone within China's own state apparatus, as actual people. And that is probably the worst part. And what really makes me quite sad about this documentary is just how it's so clear to me that the people that reported on this have no care in their own hearts for the Chinese people. If you are going to say that the CCP is the ultimate evil of all evils, and then report on this topic in such a way that makes it clear that you only care about the CCP's quote unquote surveillance atrocities in the context of how it affects your country, then I think you're an awful person. There is almost no time given to people who I suppose, are living with the regime at the moment. They obviously never give anyone who is actually Chinese in the documentary any right of reply. If you read the follow-up articles, there are always stuff like unnamed person met up with, we followed some unnamed person who met
In
up with other,
2007 or some
yeah,
shit.
exactly, who met up with some other unnamed people at a shopping mall. And we thought that was suspicious. And I'm like, just get a grip. Like, you are deeply unserious. And if you think about the people that have been interviewed as part of this, it's just to me so clear that they went into this, as Josephine already said, with a pre-approved agenda. Like, the xenophobic Karen agenda is what they signed off on, and they just carry that throughout the entire piece. So if we think about how it works in sections, if anyone hasn't seen it yet, I'm going to spare you the joy of seeing it. I'm going to describe it very briefly to you right now. So what happens essentially first is they talk a little bit about a prominent case back in 2017 where Chinese businessmen had donated money to the National Party at the time, right? There were 3 businessmen and they had convictions at the time. And essentially they were charged and convicted of obtaining a benefit by deception. So people were saying that they had deceived the National Party about where their donation money came from. And there was a whole blah in the courts, essentially, which said that what they were charged with wasn't actually what had happened. So the SFO basically acknowledged that these people had deceived the National Party about where the money had come from, but they hadn't actually benefited from it in any way themselves. Like, there was no, like, they couldn't point to a benefit that these people had just because they gave money to Simon Bridges, essentially, after having a fancy dinner with him and the press sec of the party at the time. And just before anyone calls me a tanky, because I know that's already going to happen, do I think that people should not be helping the National Party gain a foothold in this country? Sure. I don't think anyone should donate any money to the National Party, whether they are Chinese or not, first off. But I think that it's really telling to me that one of the first examples of Chinese interference is spotlighted as these 3 businessmen who gave money and eventually had their convictions quashed. But no one ever interrogates that point past that in the documentary. They're like, oh, here's 3 shady Chinese businessmen who gave money to the National Party and lied about it, and that's where it stops. And like, I'm like, okay, hang on. So the National Party accepted these donations. They had multiple meetings with these men. It's like, are we expected to really believe that they were completely in the dark about the circumstance by which the money was obtained or given? Like, let's kind of like think about that for a second, right? And to me, that framing of like, here's a thing which has happened in New Zealand that involves a Chinese person of commercial profile. The documentary goes, here's this thing, and they just leave you to sit with that information, right? Like, they're not like, there's no further explanation, there's no like follow up on the information. And the worst part is when this documentary talks about dissonance dying in New Zealand. That to me, honestly, I thought was ghoulish. They mentioned multiple dissidents, self-described dissidents in this documentary as passing away, which is horrific. I think it's awful. And these dissidents died in a car accident, right? Like, the police investigated this. It was a tragic accident. The woman in question was, I think, with her daughter in the car at the time. She swerved into them. She was in her youth. They died. It was awful. That's fine. But I think to set it up and to suggest that this was a deliberate act of sabotage is honestly quite ghoulish, when it's an obvious accident that affected not only obviously the dissidents' lives and their families' lives, but the woman herself, right, and her daughter who were in that car accident. And it's just so disgusting to me for this documentary to go, but what about this? And it's like, you've turned a very tragic event into a conspiracy yourself. And they've suggested here that the reason why it was decided that it was actually just an accident was because of Chinese sabotage within the New Zealand police. Like, what? Like,
I'm sure they've got the receipts for that. I'm sure, surely
you would think that, but funnily enough, there are actually little to no receipts in this entire documentary, which is amazing.
Garbage.
Yeah, that was
Garbage.
fascinating.
Right?
How they implicated the New Zealand police for being in cahoots with
the CCP.
That's amazing.
To me, I can't imagine, like, can you imagine the local police force in Tokoroa, okay, being in cahoots with the CCP. Where you say it out loud, it sounds ludicrous because it absolutely is, I think.
Listen, as someone who sits down with these sergeants, they're China boos, they hate New Zealand, they in fact hate the white race, Ginny. These sergeants from Tokoroa, who I talk with regularly, you wouldn't believe. They've got like figures of the VTubers on their walls.
They've
It's
got Xi
crazy.
Jinping's picture in their office.
Yeah, they're all saluting to him every morning. Like, that is what this documentary wants you to believe, is that when they use language like, you know, China has struck at the heart of New Zealand's democracy in Tokoroa through to a terrible murder accident, they expect you to believe that there are these, that for decades and decades and decades, and they say this way, they imply that since the 1950s, that there's been a concerted effort by the CCP to plant people in New Zealand who are CCP radicalists, right? That is the line documentary is taking, is unbeknownst to us, we've been living in a world operated and puppeted by Chinese spies, which is, I think, frankly ludicrous. And you should not be able to say this stuff as a journalist and have little to no receipts. And the fact that people are praising this documentary, to me, is actually really, really jarring. I find it ridiculous.
And part of the, sort of discursive strategy is that eerie music throughout it's like,
So
Yeah,
embarrassing.
we're not on the X-Files. Like, what is this? Like, what is the point of this actually? It's actually quite ridiculous.
Olivier, one of our other frequent guests, posted another thing in this realm this morning, saying, I get that New Zealand media is going to do a certain amount of Red Scare Sinophobia, but referencing CIA documents from the 50s as gospel is farcical. And the line in the article, it references these documents in this just absurd way. And then it says, if we are the frog in China's pot, we've been simmering away for a very long time now, getting ever closer to boiling point.
The restraint that they had not to say hot pot must have been so hard.
Or like, just like say, if we are the bat in China's pot, this is the level at which these journalists are working. It's dirty tabloid pap.
Just to the listeners, I mean, the way in which China is approached in New Zealand media or in general Western media is like this horrible gray country where the CCP is just so dictatorial and people have no freedom. This is a country of 1.4 billion people. It has a history of philosophizing, of academic achievements, discussions. It's not without the people's consent that the government is operating. It's really stupid to assume that. This government has delivered, the Chinese government has delivered to its people what almost no other post-colonial nation has been able to achieve, lifting 800 million people out of poverty, building public infrastructure. I mean, let's have some balance in our understanding of, China and CCP. India and China, for example, India is where I'm from, got independence or decolonized, in a superficial way, I would say, around the same time, and we adopted Western liberal democracy, and China had a revolution, and where we are in terms of addressing the needs of our people, at least 200 million people are below poverty line in India. To about 25% of India's population is multidimensionally poor. These abstract values of liberalism do not feed people, right? China has achieved a lot of things. The democratic needs of people include food, include housing, include infrastructure, and China has delivered that. So let's look at China in a balanced way. And I this is what I want to tell New Zealand journalism, the Karens of this documentary. Please look at China, in a balanced way.
In a normal way.
But I just wanted to mention as well, again, because I know that people are going to call me a tanky, and it's going to happen every single time. I think that in terms of the stuff that gets brought up, like the allegations around intimidation by Chinese intelligence services, the accessing of New Zealand data by overseas foreign intelligence services, things like that, I don't think that these things don't happen. But I think that we should be pragmatic about other countries doing these things to us as well. Especially, as Josephine said before, and everyone else has mentioned this cast, the United States. Like, we are willingly signing up to multiple data sharing agreements and to focus on China's ability to access this data or taking efforts to access this data and making them sound like James Bond villains is actually quite ludicrous to me.
I'm not worried
Like-
about them being James Bond. Like, see, when the US takes our data and sends it to the intelligence services, they just send it on to corporates so they can market to us, and we get what we want from Temu. But when China steals our data, they're going to use it in Oriental black magic. And I think
Oh my God.
I mean, I, you're right. I do fundamentally believe that there are people that think those things, that people that make real policy choices for the country actually do think those things, which is ridiculous. And I think if you want to make a China documentary or a documentary about Chinese influence or the Chinese impact on your home country and your home state, you should do it in a way that ensures that the documentary isn't 70% innuendo. Do you know what I mean? It shouldn't just be, here's what we heard 20 years ago from a source that we think we can't name that actually is a secondary source of someone that we may have talked to at some point in time.
Yeah, you should be mad about this if you're a China hawk. This is completely undermining the information space for you. Like, this makes your argument look idiotic. People will watch this and think, what the fuck was that? Like, it's frustrating.
Yeah, it's bizarre. And I think that I've seen this point being made online that you could make this exact same documentary about other countries' influence, and not just the US, but also like other large powers. But because China isn't actually, but because those other powers are not considered to be threatening by the New Zealand government, they will never get this framing. And it's just, I just wish that the outcome of this wasn't that everyone on my timeline just went completely feral and started hating China. Because I've been seeing people that I would consider otherwise level-headed say some things, as Carl mentioned before, about how if we align ourselves with China, that it's a huge mistake because the CCP is doing genocidal stuff ideologically on the daily. And to anyone who says that to me with a straight face, I implore you to look at the US assistance and funding of the current real genocide happening in Gaza. If you can look at me and tell me that the CCP, with a straight face, by the way, and tell me that I'm a tanky for thinking that this documentary is poorly produced because China is a genocidal country, please just find it in your heart somewhere and rustle up that one single brain cell and just read anything critically from Al Jazeera, even if we have to be a mainstream outlet here. Read anything critically about what the US is doing to people actively with the consent of its ruling political party in Gaza. I think it's so manifestly unfair to have this documentary be lauded and not criticized for just being a poor piece of media work in general, but also that we are obviously as a country now with this documentary carrying water for US and Western imperial interests. Like, I don't think that there is a great need or drive within this country to have produced this, if you know what I mean. Who is lying awake at night in our mainstream media thinking, oh, I really got to get China, I really got to get him, right? As Josephine said, we're literally doing press to prepare the country for us to go in the AUKUS direction. That's what it is. And if we don't critique this media as a piece of Western imperial propaganda, we are doing the entirely wrong thing. That we're doing it a disservice, and our country.
It's going to win awards next year as well, like at our news awards and stuff. You just know that's going to listen. As a reader of the Epoch Times, 5,000 years of Chinese history, China before communism, Ginny. No, I was just going to say, you brought up a story before, which I think people need to understand who are the people involved in this. So, like Professor Anne-Marie Brady, about whom it is defamatory to say she's on the NZSIS payroll because she could be doing it for free. Is someone who, and you mentioned this incident before, had a Chinese person come onto the same bus that she was on. That person, who was Chinese, then got off 3 stops away from the Chinese embassy, and she said she thought she was being followed by a Chinese spy and being intimidated by it, which is essentially the professorial equivalent of a woman in a white neighborhood in St. Louis seeing one single black person and being like, oh my God, the gangs are here, MS-13. It is just the most absurd, racist horse shit you can imagine. And I'm so sorry. Everyone keeps on mentioning the word tanky, and I'm going to out myself as a communist here. I'm very confused by this because I don't understand what this has to do with Hungary. in 1956. Notwithstanding the fact that Khrushchev coming to power was part of what split China from the Soviet Union diplomatically and allowed China to ally with the United States when Nixon visited, precipitating its turn toward Dungism. Like, I'm very confused by how somebody could be a tanky if they're a China supporter. The term is campus. If you're here on Twitter, you want to call people campists. That's the proper leftist term of, and also unserious. Unserious is the other slur that you want to use against people. You don't want to say tanky, okay? It doesn't make any sense. You're going to out yourself as a rube.
I also want to like mention that, you know, there are critical narratives on the Xinjiang issue, and maybe people want to read it. Look at Jeffrey Sachs' position on that narrative. Number one, this Xinjiang genocide narrative was constructed during the time of Trump. Trump's own State Department lawyers couldn't find enough evidence of a genocide. I just invite people to look at the critical counter narratives of Western. Again, I think that this is another, discursive strategy to justify war against China. Xinjiang has a history, which also we need to look at in the border regions, and whether CIA has some role to play in instigating terror on the border regions of China, like they have in many cases, in countries that they want to destroy. So yeah, just being a little bit more critical about these narratives. And just to think of it, the United States, which is actively committing genocide on Palestinian people, in the 21st century alone, killed more than 1 million people through the Iraq war, displaced many million people in the largest refugee crisis in modern history, in Syria, destroyed Africa's most prosperous country, Libya, another Muslim majority country. These people don't have any intent to protect Muslims. Suddenly they are concerned about Muslims in China. There is really something we need to approach it with a critical mind.
They don't care about Chinese Muslims. It's just a rhetorical device. They're just a stick to beat, to whip up a Chinese Red Scare. And I think, like the thing is, it's impossible to look, if you were to actually have an accurate assessment of on the ground issues within Xinjiang, I think that you would not be able to do it without being hypocritical, because the issues are largely ones of, for example, surveillance capitalism and technologies being levied against populations in that way, or the war on terror narratives which China's made use of, and it's done these to far less of an extent than the United States has done, than New Zealand has participated in. It is impossible to look at those issues, and again, you point out genocide was just sort of a ridiculous smear basically, and look at them in a realistic way without, again, critiquing our own position, because we are much more implicated in many of these same contemporary issues than is being levied against that population. So they don't care about it. Something else, there's so much that's been touched on here, but another thing is talking about infrastructure. Like, if you were to look at it, and they are rational, and we've made jokes about, old tropes of yellow peril and that, but really you have to see this kind of you have to buy into the idea that the CPC is somehow, mysterious and inscrutable to come to these points, right? If you understood them as rational actors, if you understood China as a great power which has the same sort of internal contradictions and the same sorts of material interests as many other current countries do, and many other great powers have done throughout history, then I think you would have to understand that the rational position for New Zealand would be to pivot away from the United States, which is a decaying empire, and pivot towards China. Like, if you were going to be a rational realist about this, you would bandwagon with China, because at the very least we would get high-speed rail out of it, which I desperately want. President Xi Jinping, what do I need to do to get high-speed rail? For the love of God, give it to us.
Yes, please.
China's giving away loans. They're giving away loans. Please.
You don't need to pivot that hard, though, right? You could just join the non-aligned movement, right? You can.
New Zealand's part of Belt and Road. Why not?
We could just have no serious ball in the game. Like, we are a small trading island nation. We ostensibly, less ostensibly than ever before, have an independent foreign policy. Actually live by that. I absolutely do not want us to be the Israel of the Pacific and a US aircraft carrier in the Pacific. Like
Yeah.
I do not want Aotearoa to be that. That's an obscene place to end up, but that's the track that China hawks, Western chauvinists, and US imperialists want us to go down. And like it really is that decision, folks. This is not hyperbole. That is where things like AUKUS and its interoperability kind of functions lead us. It forces us onto those train tracks. And we've talked about this for years now on One of 200. It is very clear that this is what is trying to happen to create a theater of war in the Pacific, as the fall of US hegemony forces them, or I think encourages them to be more aggressive in terms of China containment. Its hegemonic opponents, and just have some better level of analysis than what we're currently seeing. I swear to God.
Let's look very quickly, I think, at some of
It has to be
the
very
facts
quickly because
if you
we
wanna-
are running
Yeah, I'm
late.
sorry. If you wanted to compare China and the United States, for example, if you're concerned about Chinese spy influence, a lot of that has to be based on innuendo. And I have no doubt that there is some level of Chinese spying that occurs within New Zealand, because that's simply what great powers do, right? Like that would be a rational thing to do. But if you wanted to look at what the United States, that we know of, by the way, this is things that we know of, has done and continues to do in New Zealand. It has a spy base here. It has had spy bases here, actual physical infrastructure. The people who revealed that at Waihopai were prosecuted by the New Zealand state for doing so, for revealing the fact the United States has spy bases here. If you want to look at it directly at one of our neighbors, at Pine Gap in Australia, the attempt by Gough Whitlam in 1975 to wind down CIA operations in Australia is what led to him being deposed in a constitutional coup. So you are not allowed to question US influence to the extent that they will make you a puppet regime, they will overthrow your leaders. And it was non-violent in Australia's case, but of course in the third world it's violent, that happens. And in New Zealand, that would be the same, that if we tried to turn away too much from the United States, you would almost certainly expect not only the sort of media fervor, but that they would try to depose our leaders through the use of the Governor General, because that happened in Australia. And if you want to look at spy history recently, first of all, I mean, we've talked about in the past that cable leaks, allowed us to find out that New Zealand was putting human intelligence on the ground in France to interfere with the French presidential elections in 2012. So we are foot soldiers for the United States and its empire in terms of our spying. The Five Eyes itself and the revelations that came from Snowden means that there is full take data being taken from all New Zealanders and then being given back to our spy agencies through Canada, through the United States, through Australia. So everything that you do on your computer will be going into systems where our spy agencies are able to access that in the United States.
But at least I won't be able to see our Twitter likes anymore.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to look at what's happened most recently, you brought this up, Kyle, as well, is that it turns out that American spy agencies were using and piggybacking on GCSB infrastructure for almost a decade within this country without anybody in the executive, i.e. elected officials like politicians, being told or being made aware of it. When it came out, they said, whoops, our bad, not going to do that anymore. And the official opposition, which at that time was Labour, as it still is the opposition, said, yeah, we don't think that's going to happen again, so we're not worried about it. Let's not look into it. So if you wanted to know what the influence is like factually from the United States, that's the most bare level analysis of things that we know. And if you wanted to look at leaks of things that happened in the past, like, for example, the CIA used to directly have reporters on its payroll in the 1980s. And if you wanted to look at, for example, COINTELPRO and IntelPro, where there were assassination programs carried out by the FBI, the Years of Lead. There was a strategy of tension that was put throughout Operation Gladio and its associate programs throughout Europe and almost certainly in New Zealand, that we have these revelations from the 1970s that ordinary people were being assassinated on behalf of the American spy interests in the American security state, that people were being spied on and having dossiers put against them, that our own GCSB has done that against Green Party members and elected politicians, almost certainly on behalf and at the behest of American imperial interests. And those are things that we know basically from leaks from a few decades ago. What is happening now is almost certainly exactly the same thing, amplified much more because we simply don't know those things, but we occasionally get leaks about them. And it will only be known a couple of decades from now exactly what is going on at this moment. But you can almost guarantee that whatever innuendo is being spun about China, it is 100 times worse.
Well, some investigative journalists could maybe pick up on that and do a documentary with some spooky music playing over the background.
Yeah, and I find it fascinating that one of the articles mentioned that the NZSIS is now focused on 3 countries. Number 1, China, then Iran, and then Russia. And I'm like, what a coincidence! Like,
Classic threat to New Zealand, Iran, of course.
It's so barefaced. It's so stupid. It's so.
Let's also remember that this is the institution that was focused exclusively on the Muslim community for internal terror threats until March 15. So this is the history of New Zealand SIS, and these journalists are not critiquing any of that history or asking any questions about their history and what they're doing at the moment.
I think that's a good place to leave it, because this has been a long episode. So thank you so much for everyone who's managed to keep their headphones on and listen the whole way through. We are already so far past time that we're going to do fucking shout outs. Ginny, where can people find you?
I'm Eggs for Dogs everywhere. Blue Sky and Twitter. I don't post about politics too much though, only when someone tries to troll Kyle, then I get really angry and subtweet them.
Simon, where can we find you?
I'm at Original Mythros, MYTHROS on Twitter, and I have a podcast called Go Han or Go Home, which you should listen to.
Dr. Josephine Varghese, where can we find you?
Whoa, okay. I'm at People Not Profits, but the spelling is not correct. So I guess if you just search for Josephine Varghese, you'll find my Twitter account. That's where I post politics, but I also have an Instagram account, but it's private. But I do politics is the only thing I post there. So if you're really keen, send me a request.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you also to Mark, who had to shoot off early. Always really great to have him on the podcast to give us insights about the New Zealand political machine. That's been another episode of Current Events with 1 of 200. We have a midweek podcast lined up looking at an incoming film. So we'll see that for you in the midweek slot, and we'll be back again next weekend for Current Events. That's been us. Catch you later.
If artificers are, then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's apart now. It's paid with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when the criticism cost me ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking rain. It feels like we're on the road to hell.